Yeah, that's kind of how I arrived at this topic. But it's really interesting because it's very much, if you read the book, I don't know if we have a copy of it at the U-House library, but if you do read the book, or if you listen to the audiobook, you really do kind of get a sense of not just the ethnocentrism, but also the prevailing attitudes in the Dar al-Islam at the time period. But we'll get into that a little more later. Well, we're going to start off with the person at the center of this very, very long road trip. Sorry? Yes. Would you just give me like 10 seconds, please? The man behind all of this, the very fun to say named Ibn Battuta. He was a Moroccan traveler and also an Islamic scholar who was born originally in Tangier, Morocco in 1304. His early life is not incredibly well known, but we do know that he was born into a very wealthy family of Qadis, or I'm sure I'm saying that wrong too, or Islamic judges. So he was, by the standards of the time period, very well educated and very intellectual. He could read and write, and he was as you'll see later in the presentation, he was a lover of poetry and of music. Most of his education came from the Sunni Maliki school in Tangier, which was the dominant madrasa, or center of Islamic learning and Islamic jurisprudence in North Africa at the time period, in the early 14th century. So again, we don't know a whole lot about his early life, but he set out on his very long road trip in 1325, which spanned 3 decades, and also, well, that depends. Do you count the Middle East as a continent? Because if you do, then he went to 4, but he went to Africa, Europe, and Asia, all over. And I will show you now a map. I love maps. So, as you can see, there's a great key right here, but it started out here in Tangier, Morocco. Anybody here ever been to Tangier, Morocco before? Okay, a few hands are up. Nice. I have not, but maybe one day. He travels along the coast of North Africa, spends a little bit of time in Egypt. I'll get more into the routes and everything a little later, but this red arrow was his first trip from across North Africa and to the Levant cities like Damascus, Jerusalem, down into Medina and Mecca, which are the 2 holiest sites in Islam. I'll get more into that later. Egypt, and also what was at the time Mongol-era Persia. This was his second voyage, which was done mostly by ship. You can see he traveled from Mecca south of the Red Sea, along the, well actually, part of this for some reason isn't included in the map, but he did go inland into what is now Ethiopia, to Mogadishu, along the east coast of Africa, cities like Mombasa and Kilwa, and then up again the Indian Ocean toward what now is today the country of Oman, through into the Persian Gulf, and then back further inland to return to Mecca. The third voyage actually started here, but ended up taking a route up to the coast of Syria, and then through what today is Turkey, what was at the time part of the Byzantine Empire, and took a ship to the Black Sea, to a Genoese colony, and across Central Asia to the city of Astrakhan, which today I believe is in Russia. And then across Central Asia, Samarkand, Kabul. It's not, if you can see the dashed lines, those are disputed. It's not 100% clear from history whether or not he actually took that route, but he did end up in India, across India, down into, what's the heck? It's not called Calicut anymore. Anybody ever been to India? What's the name of this? That's not the name they use anymore. changed a lot of its names post-independence. Maldives, Ceylon, or Sri Lanka, up to Chittagong, or what today is Calcutta, south through the Strait of Malacca, and then up into China to Guangzhou, what today is also part of, or what was considered Canton. Supposedly took a trip to Beijing too, but again, the details of that are so vague that many historians don't consider that to be fact. And then south, you can't see it on the map here, but he did take a trip south, up through Persia, returned home to Tangier, and then traveled. His last travels were into what today is part of Spain, and what is now Mali and Niger in West Africa, before returning back to Morocco in 1354 and spending the rest of his life there. But we'll start off with the first section of the trip, North Africa. So for those of you who are familiar with Islam, Muslims must make a pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca, in what today is in Saudi Arabia, at least once in their lives. And at the age of 21, Ibn Battuta left Tangier to make that Hajj. But he didn't just leave for religious reasons, because he was a Islamic scholar and Islamic legal intellectual. He left to acquire more knowledge and learn from Islamic scholars from all over the world as well. So he left Tangier and stopped along the way in a number of cities along the north coast of Africa. And I'm sure I'm saying them wrong, but please bear with me. Algiers, Tunis, Constantine, and Tripoli. There is a Tripoli. Is it Tripoli or Tripoli? Tripoli? Okay, cool. Which are in Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, respectively. Originally, and the goal was ultimately to make a stop in Cairo, and stay in Cairo for a bit before continuing to Mecca. And along the way, Battuta and his caravan exchanged many fine gifts with regional leaders, and even spent 2 months at a madrasa, or Islamic university, in Tunis. And at that madrasa, he was appointed a Qadi, and I'm sure I'm saying that wrong too. But Qadi, or an Islamic judge. There are some rumors from this journey across North Africa that Ibn Battuta was married in Libya to the daughter of a scholar from Fez, and that their wedding feast was said to have lasted a whole day. Whether or not that's actually true is hard to clarify, but that is speculated. And while traveling across North Africa, if you read his, I'll be using quotes from the book periodically throughout this presentation, but while traveling across North Africa in his early 20s, he recorded feelings of homesickness. And it was sad for him to be away from home. He wrote, "I felt so sad at heart on account of my loneliness that I could not restrain the tears that started to my eye, and I wept bitterly. But one of the pilgrims, realizing the cause of my distress, came up to me with a greeting and friendly welcome, and continued to comfort me with friendly talk until I entered the city," that city being Cairo. He arrives in Egypt in 1326, the city of Alexandria first. In this city, and while he was in Alexandria, Battuta recorded his marvel and awe of the busy ports, the magnificent architecture, the centers of Islamic learning, and what was left of the famous lighthouse of Alexandria, which at that time had not been operated in many centuries. But from there, he traveled to Cairo, and he wrote of similar feelings at what he saw in Cairo: the pyramids of Giza, the city's markets, mosques, madrasas, and even their hospitals too. And again, I'm going to bring up one other thing too. This word right here is zakat. That's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, which loosely translates to charity. Zakat is a form of almsgiving, and hospitals are seen in the Islamic world as a representation of that pillar of Islam. So he wrote, "Rich and poor were treated alike without fees, and 60 orphans were supported and educated in a neighboring school in Cairo." It's impressed him quite a bit. He spent about a month in Cairo before traveling up the Nile River to the Red Sea port of Adyad. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong too. in order to sail across the Red Sea to Jeddah in Arabia. And along the way, he stopped at other madrasas and met with other Islamic scholars. There's a famous passage in the writings, too, where he goes to a bathhouse in Egypt and was appalled at the nudity in the bathhouse, ironically enough. And he then complained to the local governor, and the governor then proceeded to change the rules regarding nudity in their bathhouses. Ironic a bit, but at the same time, this is a very, very strictly religious person who probably has strong opinions about that sort of thing. By the time they reached the town of Bajad, though, there was considerable political unrest at the time, and so they were forced to turn around. So then Ibn Battuta were forced to retrace their steps and go back to Cairo before returning to Mecca. But they didn't go immediately back the same way. They took a long sort of route for a little bit more sights. And so they stopped, or they took a route through, and I'll show you on the map a little bit, but they took a route through the Levant, the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. After another short stay in Cairo, Ibn Battuta traveled ultimately with the goal of stopping in the city of Damascus. But along the way, he stopped in a number of other holy sites in the Levant. First, the city of Hebron, and my Old Testament is a little rough here, but if I remember correctly, Hebron is believed to be the birthplace of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm sure someone will probably correct me about that later, but it's a holy site to Muslims as well. And I couldn't get a picture of the mosque, but there's a very famous mosque in Hebron, in what today is part of the Palestinian territories. And then Battuta traveled to Jerusalem, to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which, if you know anything about that, is the third holiest site in Islam. It's where Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. And so Battuta wrote more of the marvel that he felt in Jerusalem, particularly while making the point to stop before Friday prayer at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then after a short stint in Jerusalem, he continued up to Damascus, which was the economic superpower of the time. And it was not part of the Mongol section of the section of Persia that was part of the Mongol Empire. It was part of a Mamluk Sultanate. And he wrote of the people and the wealth and gardens of Damascus as, well, there's a quote up here. As for Damascus, she is the paradise of the Orient. She hath adorned herself with flowers of sweet-scented herbs and displayed herself in brocaded vestures from her gardens. The townsfolk supply their needs for food and clothing, although students never beg for anything of the kind from them. So he took. He felt impressed by the religious observances of the people that he encountered in Damascus. But after staying in Damascus, he traveled to the city of Mecca, further south, to perform the Hajj for the first time. At that point in time, he had completed the fifth of the 5 pillars of Islam. But he still was not interested in returning home, and he completed the Hajj in late 1326, and following the new year, traveled north to Persia to encounter Sufi Muslims for the first time. Have any of you here heard of the term whirling dervishes? Okay, so whirling dervishes are a term, I'm not entirely sure where it comes from, but it comes from the observance of a very common Sufi Muslim dance. And I'll show you a picture of it later. But Sufi Muslims were known for their fine music and dance and their poetry at the time period. They were artistic, putting it mildly. And while in Persia, Ibn Battuta visited the cities of Basra, Isfahan, and Shiraz. I'm sure I'm pronouncing those wrong too, so sorry. There's a passage in his travels where he talks about he noticed that one of the imams at a mosque in Basra made a slight error in the grammar of the Quran, and noted that he felt a bit offended by that error in grammar. But then he traveled later to Isfahan, and also little bit of a tangent here, because this is kind of important. But at this time, this part of what today is in Iran had been absorbed into the Mongol Empire as part of the Ilkhanate. By this time period, Persia had been part of the Mongol Empire for about 70 years. However, during the Mongol conquest of Persia, many cities and Islamic architecture were destroyed and thousands were killed. So it took a while for both cities like Basra and Isfahan to fully rebuild after Mongol conquest. And this is only about 70 years later. But if you know anything about building cities, especially with 14th century methods, you'll know that that takes a long time, longer than 70 years. While he was in Shiraz, he noted again of the educated and learned people he encountered, the pious nature of its residents, and the mosques that he visited, which he claimed rivaled those in Damascus. And he also praised Persian women quite a bit. You'll notice this a lot in Ibn Battuta's writings if you ever read them. There's a lot of observances about gender across the Islamic world, which vary greatly even though these places were united by a common religion. So, for example, gender in West Africa, in Islamic West Africa, differ quite a bit from gender in places like Persia or Muslim India. But he wrote of the women that he noticed in Persia. The people of Shiraz are distinguished by piety, sound religion, and purity of manners, especially the women. Interesting. But he didn't stay here for too long. After Shiraz, he then moved on to the city of Baghdad. So, another very short tangent. I'm going to go off on a few short tangents because it's kind of important for a little bit of context, but you'll have to bear with me. Baghdad, starting in about the 8th century, was once the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, which was one of the first Islamic empires, and was for many centuries the center of learning and science and intellectualism throughout the Islamic world, and arguably throughout the rest of the world as well. For example, scientists and scholars in Baghdad were among the first to discover the chemical formula for alcohol. They invented algebra and algorithms. The prefix al in those words comes from when Arabic was the language of science. If any of you here are interested in history of science. But by 1258, Baghdad had been sacked by the Mongols and was absorbed into the Mongol Empire as the capital of the Ilkhanate, which was I'll show you a map of the Mongol Empire a little later, but that was the section of the Mongol Empire that included Persia and a little bit of Western Asia as well. But when Ibn Battuta arrived in Baghdad, about 70 years after the Mongol conquest, quite a bit of the city had been restored, including a very famous university, and I'm sure I'm saying this wrong too, called Al-Mustansiriya. Does anybody here speak Arabic? Okay, me neither. I'm just trying my best here. He wrote again of the warm welcomes that he received from the Baghdadis, and he marveled at their bathhouses and their mosques and their markets. He even took a tour of the city with the Ilkhan himself, the Mongol ruler of Persia. Big deal. He wrote of his great admiration and affection for the Ilkhan, who apparently could speak both Arabic and Persian, and was an accomplished musician and an accomplished poet. And again, if you are a Muslim scholar, being an accomplished poet is a big deal. Because the Quran, if you ever listen to Islamic scholars recite passages from the Quran, it's usually done in a form of poetry. Poetry is considered a fine, very, very fine art in the Islamic world. But he stayed in Baghdad for a few months, took another very short visit to the city of Tabriz, which is in modern-day Azerbaijan, I believe. No, it is in Azerbaijan. Sorry, I gotta get my geography right. And then joined another royal caravan, or returned to Baghdad, and from Baghdad joined another royal caravan back to the city of Mecca. At this point in time, he'd been away from home for nearly 2 years and had traveled over 4,000 miles. He needed to rest for a little bit, so he spent about a year resting in the city of Mecca, studying, learning more, until he decided it was time to travel again. Where to next? Well, Battuta then took a trip south. He wanted to meet more Islamic scholars from East Africa and the southern coasts of the Arabian Peninsula. So he took a caravan from the city of Mecca to the port of Jeddah on the Arabian coast and sailed on a dhow, which I don't have a picture of it, but a dhow is a large ship, like a big sailing vessel that comes from the Arabian Peninsula and Northeast Africa to the city of Taiz in what today is part of Yemen. Again, he met with a sultan there before traveling to the port of Aden, and from the city of Aden, which is on the, it's in modern day Djibouti, at the mouth of the Red Sea, he traveled inland to the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, which still had a population of Muslims, but it was a predominantly Orthodox Christian region at that time, and still is. And he described the city of Zayla, which is in kind of what now is northern Ethiopia, the dirtiest, most disagreeable, and most stinking town in the world. Why did he describe it that way? Well, it was commonplace at that time for people to openly slaughter animals in public. Yeah, that's a little gross. So from Zayla, he then traveled to the coast, to the city of Mogadishu, in what today is Somalia, where he met, again, with more local sultans and Islamic scholars. But he wrote in his passages, or in his works from this time period, about the multi-ethnic and multilingual populations of Mogadishu. This was his first time meeting a sultan anywhere who was Black African and who wasn't Arab or Persian. Many of his scholars and legal advisors were Egyptian or Persian. The sultan could speak both Somali and could speak Arabic. Many of his subjects were either Africans, Arabs, or Persians. But then, after a short stay in Mogadishu, Ibn Battuta took a dhow further south to the ports of Mombasa, in what today is in Kenya, and the islands of Zanzibar and Pemba, which are just off the coast of Tanzania now, and then to the bustling port of Kilwa, which is the city of Kilwa no longer exists, it's ruins now, but it's in southern Tanzania. And at that time, in the early 14th century, Kilwa was a very rich, very prosperous port. There was a lot of goods flowing in and out along the Indian Ocean trade network, which could be a whole separate presentation. I won't go into that too much. But despite all that wealth, Ibn Battuta wrote of how impressed he was with the humility of the Sultan of Kilwa. He wrote that the Sultan of Kilwa was a man of great humility. He sits with poor brethren, eats with them, and greatly respects men of religion and noble descent. Have any of you been to Tanzania before? I have. Anybody else?
To where?
Tanzania in East Africa. So this is what's left of the mosque at Kilwa. It's not, obviously, it's ruins now, but this was at one point a mosque and a connected madrasa, or Islamic center of learning, in what was the city of Kilwa. After a short stay in Kilwa, Ibn Battuta then sailed north and found himself in the southern section of Arabia, at the city of, and I'm sure I'm saying this wrong, Khalkhat, in what today is part of Oman. He then traveled on foot from the coast to the Khalkhat, but was very nearly killed in an attempted robbery by the guide that he hired to take him there. Sorry?
I'm just curious, where did his money come from? How was he able to?
He was born into a very wealthy family.
That's it.
Yes. He was a very wealthy, well-respected Islamic legal scholar. Came from a family of very well-respected Islamic legal scholars. So he was a rich dude.
But he must have carried a lot of
He
money.
did. Silk, slaves, salt, which was a big deal at the time period because this was before refrigerators, and salt was how people preserved food. So without salt, people died. That went to a dark place very quickly. Where was I? Oh, yes, sorry. He stayed again with the Sultan of Khalkhat before traveling into the Strait of Hormuz, which was right here, into the Persian Gulf, and marveled more and more at the markets and bazaars overflowing with goods and riches from Persia and India. He also encountered pearl fishing for the first time. But after a short stint along the Strait of Hormuz, he traveled back to Mecca, which is right here. If my geography is sort of correct, it's in this section of Arabia, and took more time there to rest and study before setting out on the next part of his journey, which took him to Anatolia. And I've got more pictures in the next slide, so don't worry about all this writing. Battuta then took a caravan from Mecca up to the coast of what is now Syria, and then left northern Syria by a ship from Genoa for the Mediterranean port of Alanya in what today is in Turkey. And Battuta wrote more and more of the hospitality and piety and beauty of the towns that he visited when he was in Anatolia. He wrote of, traveled the sea for 10 nights, the Christians treated us honorably and took no passage money from us. This is interesting too. Its people are the most handsome of men, the cleanest in their dress, the most delicious in their food, and the kindliest folk in creation. Curious. This is also the time period, I should tell you too, this was before, for those of you that remember anything from Lowell's Ottoman Empire series, this was before the Byzantine Empire had been sacked by the Ottomans. This was over 100 years before that. So there was still a sizable Greek Orthodox Christian population in Anatolia, but they kind of merged fairly well with Muslim Turks. And he marveled more at the towns that he visited, like Konya and Antalya, which are on the southern coast of what is now Turkey, met more Sufi Muslims, and wrote more of his fascinations with their love of music and dance. And he also wrote more of the women that he encountered. Again, you'll find this theme a bit throughout some of his writings. A remarkable thing which I saw in this country was the respect to women by the Turks, for they hold a more dignified position than the men. How curious, especially compared to other parts of the Islamic world, like Morocco. He also scorned the treatment of enslaved women and the open practice of prostitution in this part of the world. The inhabitants of this city make no effort to stamp out immorality. They buy beautiful Greek slave girls and put them out into prostitution, and each girl has to pay a regular due. Interesting. I find it curious that he notes that the Turkish women that he encounters, he reveres with great respect, and yet he also scorns the treatment of non-Muslim women, Greek women, right, who were not Muslim Turks. They were slaves. Yeah, that's also true. And the practice of slavery was a common practice in the Islamic world at the time, although it was that could be a whole separate presentation, like maybe 5 whole separate presentations. But so the institutions of slavery were still in place. They're just, again, I don't want to get too off track here, but it was a common feature. So here I've got a quick map. I don't know if you can see, but there's a city here called Acre. I don't know what my modern day geography is not great, but it's in present day Israel. And then he took a ship north along the coast, or up to the coast. You can't see it here, but there's a town of Alanya, which is like right here, just a little bit due west of what today is Antakya or Antioch. And then traveled overland, kind of around Anatolia, and I'll get more to this part a little later. But these are whirling dervishes. Does this look familiar to anybody? Yeah. So you've seen I don't have enough space, and I don't trust myself to spin quickly here, but they hold out their arms, and then they kind of spin around, and they keep their head facing one direction, and then they turn, and then they keep their head facing that direction again before they turn again. It's a Turkish Muslim dance. I will not demonstrate it, sorry, because I don't want to hurt anybody. But after his time in Anatolia, Ibn Battuta then left in 1331, to the port of Sinop, which is in present-day northern Turkey, to cross the Black Sea into the Golden Horde, which is the section of the Mongol Empire that today is Russia and Kazakhstan. I've got a map in the next slide. I'll show you a map. But he traveled to the Genoese colony of Kaffa in what today is part of the Crimea. There lived a population of traders from all over the region, Genoa, well, not the region, but from all over the Mediterranean and Europe, Genoa, Venice, Egypt, and even Russia. There was only one mosque in that town too, which was not great for Ibn Battuta, considering he was a pretty pious Muslim, but most of the people in that area were Christians anyways. When he arrived in Sinop, he received news that the Khan of the Golden Horde, a ruler by the name, and I'm sure I'm saying this wrong too, of Ozbeg, sent him a protected caravan to escort him up the Volga River to his nomadic capital. So another thing too, the Mongols in the Golden Horde didn't situate themselves in a single city. They moved throughout the region of the Golden Horde and collected tribute from their subjected cities, which varied also in different parts of the Mongol Empire, and I will show you a map, I promise. And again, Battuta marveled more at the treatment of animals and of the women of the Golden Horde, but he also didn't really like the food they gave him. This quote here talks of the respect that they revere of women and of all of the wealth of each of the Khan's wives. But now I'd like to show you a map, my favorite visual aid. So here is the Mongol Empire at the time of Ibn Battuta.
Which part?
All of it. All four of these were the Mongol Empire, and I'm going to get to that in a second. So, for those of you that don't know, Mongol Empire was founded by a ruler from Central Asia by the name of Genghis Khan. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, after he and his tribe had taken all of this land, which is the largest land empire in history, and they were able to take more land in 25 years, and the Romans were able to take it in 400 years. These four sections were divided among his sons and their sons. So the Golden Horde is what today is Russia and Ukraine and a bit of Kazakhstan, up the north edge of the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, and along the Volga River. Kind of very close to the cities of Kiev and Moscow. But this section here is what we sometimes commonly refer to as Mongol Russia. This is the Ilkhanate. So this is, for lack of a better term, Mongol Persia. It's not just present-day Iran, it's also bits of what is now Iraq, what is now the Central Asian countries of Afghanistan and Turkmenistan. But this is the Ilkhanate, which was Mongol Persia. The Chagatai Khanate was Mongol Central Asia, right based out of their capital of Samarkand. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong too, in what today is in Uzbekistan. And the Empire of the Great Khan, for lack of a better term, was China, Mongol-era China. Or, if any of you here Chinese history aficionados? Okay, well the dynastic term they use is Yuan Dynasty China, but it's Mongol China. So just for a little bit of a quick reference, Battuta stayed then with the Khan of the Golden Horde, but then upon learning that his wife, who was the daughter of the Byzantine emperor at the time, was expecting a child, and who wanted to return to Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, to give birth to her child, Ibn Battuta then was allowed by the Khan to join her and a caravan to travel to the city of Constantinople in the winter of 1332-1333. So you...
Are you saying that his wife traveled with them?
No, the Khan's wife, sorry. The Khan's wife was expecting a child, and Ibn Battuta, who was with the Khan at the time, requested permission to travel with the Khan's wife
Okay.
to the city of Constantinople. Sorry about that. He arrives in Constantinople in September of 1332, and again marveled more at the markets and the architecture and of the Cathedral of St. Sophia. Have any of you here been to Istanbul? 2 of you here? 3 of you here? 4 of you? Okay. The Hagia Sophia is now a mosque, but it was not originally a mosque. For several centuries, it was a Orthodox church. It was only in 1453 that it was converted to a mosque after the Ottoman sack of Constantinople. But by the onset of winter, Ibn Battuta decided to travel east on the steppe by sailing across the Black Sea and up the Volga River to the city of New Sarai, which is in what is now Russia, to meet with the Khan. Spent a few weeks there, and then decided that he wanted to travel south to what was at the time the Sultanate of Delhi in India. But in order to do that, he would have to cross through the Mongol-controlled Central Asia, where the Chagatai Khanate, which he set out for doing. It took him 5 months to cross Central Asia between 1332 and 1333, and he wrote of the brutal cold of Central Asia. He said apparently he would take a sip of hot water, spill water down his beard, and by the time the water had fallen to the end of his beard, it had frozen solid. Which you would probably not be surprised if any of you know anything about Russia or Kazakhstan in the winter. They stopped in the city of Bukhara, and Ibn Battuta wrote here, "The mosques, colleges, and bazaars are in ruins. There is not one person in it today who possesses any learning or shows any concern for acquiring it." So he scorned their disdain for education, well, at least in the city of Bukhara. But he was there with that caravan for 54 days before he traveled through what today is Afghanistan in the spring of 1333 on the way to India. Yes?
Did he send his journals back to Tangier? Was there any communication?
He wrote this down for himself, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But when he returned, when he finished traveling, there was a poet who was hired to transcribe his travels into a book.
I see. So he kept it all with him?
Mm-hmm. He could read and write, which was a big deal for the time period. And because he could read and write, he kept pretty detailed records from his own perspective, of course. He reached India and ended up staying there for a total of about 7 years. Sorry, one second. He arrived in India, and if any of you, I'm not going to try to go on too much of a tangent here, but if any of you know anything about India at this time period, it was under the rule of the Delhi Sultanate, so the first Islamic government of India. Most of the population was not Muslim. Most of the population was predominantly Hindu, who felt a stench of resentment toward the Muslim rulers who forced them to pay higher taxes, lest they be forced to convert to Islam. But at the time period, many Indians had adopted Islam due to the economic advantages of not being subjected to separate taxes, and also the network of trade and the flow of goods in and out of India through the Islamic empire's trading routes. So, at the time, the Sultan of Delhi was a ruler by the name of Muhammad, and I'm sure I'm saying this wrong too, gosh. Muhammad Tughlaq. It's like they're trying to start a new language. He would just like every other sultan throughout the Islamic world, he recruited scholars and administrators and advisors from all over the world, including Persians and Turks. And so Ibn Battuta was hopeful for maybe a short stint in the sultan's employ as an Islamic legal scholar. But this particular sultan was known for his cruelty, even by the standards of the time period. If you ask anybody who's an aficionado of Indian history, you will know that this guy is kind of considered the Vlad the Impaler of India. He was known for executing his enemies in particularly cruel manners, too cruel for me to bring up while I'm at work. But Ibn Battuta wrote down, the Sultan was far too free in shedding blood. He used to punish small faults and great, without respect of persons, whether men of learning or piety or noble descent. But Ibn Battuta was still given a job in the Sultan's employ. He wrote, I approached the Sultan, who took my hand and shook it, and continuing to hold it, addressed me most kindly, saying in Persian, your arrival is a blessing. Be at ease. I shall give you such favors that your fellow countrymen will hear of it and come join you. Ibn Battuta was then employed as an Islamic judge and given assistance and a furnished home, which included its own mosque. This is part of the madrasa that Ibn Battuta worked in what today is just outside of New Delhi in India. But for the rest of the decade, there was how do I say this? Political turmoil, which feels like a bit of an understatement, because the Sultan had his hands full with a rebellion in western India and with a famine in northern India, which, if you know anything about that, was incredibly common at the time period. And the Sultan began to execute rebels in particularly cruel manners. And when the Sultan discovered at the end of the 1330s that Ibn Battuta was close friends with a Sufi man who had refused to obey the Sultan's commands, Ibn Battuta was then placed under house arrest. In an act of penitence, Battuta gave up all his possessions and lived as a hermit outside of the city of Delhi for a total of about 5 months. After which he approached the Sultan and asked if he could make another Hajj, or another trip to Mecca. But the Sultan had a different idea. He asked him if he could serve as his ambassador to the Mongol court in China, the empire of the Great Khan. So he escaped India in 1341 by attempting to flee the coast and getting robbed and attacked along the way. But after his escape, he rejoined a caravan and arrived at the port of Gandhar, which is right here, and then boarded a ship south for the port of Calicut. And I think it's Kerala. Kochi. It's Kochi. Sorry, the city now is called Kochi. 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 In the southern state of Tamil Nadu in India. He joined a fleet of Chinese junks, which were I don't have a picture of it. That's the type of ship that was built and used by the Chinese at the time, with the aim of sailing around India and up into Chittagong and then going over land into China. But because 2 of the junks that he joined were sunk in a storm, he feared he couldn't return to Delhi because the Sultan would have him executed for failing to reach China. But then he decided to look for the help of another sultan in southern India in the city of, I can't read that, crap. But the Sultan then put him on a ship that would take him south into the Maldives, north into what is now Sri Lanka, then up the Bay of Bengal to the city of Chittagong in what today is called Calcutta. So Ibn Battuta didn't originally intend to stay in the Maldives for too long. Have anybody here been to the Maldives? No? They're stunning. It's like patches of beautiful little islands with palm trees and white sand beaches. It's beautiful. Never been there myself. Would love to. They didn't originally intend to stay in the Maldives for too long, but the Sultan there offered him a job because he was in need of a new chief judge, and wined and dined him in order to convince him to stay. So Battuta spent a total of 9 months in the Maldives implementing Islamic law and supposedly taking more wives. There's a lot of stories about Ibn Battuta taking various wives throughout these trips, and whether or not it's actually true is up for debate, but it does come up. His marriages in the Maldives were somewhat different from elsewhere, as he documented, and he wrote, "It's easy to marry these islands because of the smallness of the dowries and the pleasures of the society which the women offer." So he said they never had to give too much of a dowry compared to the rest of the Islamic world. But after his stint in the Maldives, he proceeded to travel north to what today is Sri Lanka, or what at the time was called Ceylon, to visit a holy site called Adam's Peak. I can't remember exactly the significance of it in the Islamic faith, but there's a temple, mosque. There's a mosque up here. So while on the island, he met with the king, who gave him permission to summit the peak. He spent 3 days on top of this mountain before he returned to the coast. Unfortunately, yet another one of his ships was sunk, and his companions were picked up by a rescue party and returned to Sri Lanka, where they were promptly robbed by pirates. Humiliated, he then returned across the southern tip of India to the port of Calicut and boarded another ship to the Maldives, and from the Maldives he joined a Chinese junk set out for China. Traveled through the Strait of Malacca. Have any of you here been to Singapore? I told you, this was the world's longest road trip. I'm going to try and cut it short because I know people are hungry, myself included.
Okay, all right. Fine.
Does he ever get sick or talk about anything?
Well, he did talk about getting food poisoning.
Oh,
And we got plenty of food poisoning. He's talked about getting food poisoning in West Africa. But we'll get to that in a second. But yes, I am hungry, so I'll try and make this sort of quick. Took a Chinese junk from the Maldives up to the port of Chittagong, which today is in Bangladesh, which was a predominantly Muslim city even at the time. He wrote that Chittagong was filled with food that smelled terrible. He then took another Chinese junk south through the Strait of, intending to go through the Strait of Malacca, which is this body of water between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra. He stayed first in the city of Samudra. Have any of you here been to Indonesia? Am I saying that right? Samudra?
Sumatra.
The city of Samudra. There's the island of Sumatra. The city is Samudra. He stayed there for 2 weeks before setting off on another junk for China. He spent 40 days at sea before he arrived in Guangzhou, the Canton area. Supposedly he took a trip from this area up to Beijing, but like I said, that account is so vague and the details are so inconsistent that many historians don't accept that as part of his journey. But he did spend time in the cities of Guangzhou, Canton, and Fuzhou. Have any of you here been to that part of China before? It's in southern China. Very large cities. Even at the time period, they were very large cities. Battuta had some interesting views about the Chinese. He marveled at the great wealth pouring in and out of the ports and the quality of its products. He said silk is used for clothing, even by poor monks and beggars, and the porcelain was the finest of all makes of pottery. How appropriate. We still call porcelain from that area China. However, the culture shock, this was his first time living in an area that was not either predominantly Muslim or predominantly Christian, and the culture shocks and spiritual practices of the local people appalled him. He said, China was beautiful, this does not displease me. On the contrary, I was greatly troubled with the way paganism dominated this country. Whenever I went out of my lodging, I saw many blameworthy things. He said, the Chinese themselves are infidels who worship idols and burn their dead like Hindus eat the flesh of swine and dogs and sell it in their markets. And if you know anything about Muslims, you will know that eating the flesh of swine is a big no-no. You ever heard that? Have you ever heard that analogy when you give someone two bad options and you say, that's like asking a Muslim whether or not they'll have bacon or ham? I've heard that before. Crazy. So he felt more out of place in China than he had anywhere else. And after a very short stint in what today is southeastern China, he decided to return all the way back home to Morocco, which is a long way and took him approximately 3 years. In the winter of 1346, he took another junk from Guangzhou to Samudra, and then to Keelan and Calicut in southern India. By the time he reached India, however, his former employer, Muhammad Tughlaq's power was slowly waning, and he would die of illness about a year later. In the spring of 1347, took another ship across in the Indian Ocean toward Persia to the city of Hormuz. He came to Hormuz at a time of great political turmoil, as the sons and nephews of the Sultan were competing with each other for power, so he hurried quickly through Persia toward the city of Baghdad. He arrived in Baghdad, and throughout the rest of the year visited the cities of Damascus and Aleppo. And can any of you think of something really big and really terrible that was spreading all over the Western world at this time period? Bingo.
What was it?
The Black Death. Now that could be a whole separate presentation in and of itself. I took a class when I was in college that was just the history of the Black Death. But very simply put, the bubonic plague was spreading all over, not just Europe. It's very common for people to hear that about for people to hear about the effects of the bubonic plague in Europe. But it really spread all over both the Middle East and North Africa and Persia as well. And when Battuta arrived in Baghdad in 1348, he noticed that thousands were dying every day, and of the religious efforts of the population to address the plague. He wrote, the people fasted for 3 successive days. They assembled in the great mosque until it was filled to overflowing. Oh, wow. and then spent the night in prayers there after performing. Then after performing the dawn prayer, they all went out barefoot together, carrying Qurans in their hands. The Jews went out with their book of the law, and the Christians with the gospel, all of them in tears, imploring the favor of God through his books and his prophets. Oh, that's supposed to say 1340. That's supposed to say 1340. Those are backwards. I'm sorry. From after his short stint in Baghdad, he then returned to Cairo and then again to Mecca. Strangely enough, he'd been to Mecca many times at this point in his life. But he stayed there for another 4 months before returning to Morocco. By this time, he was 45 years old. He'd been gone for 24 years. He then took, after a short stint in Mecca, he then took a ship from Egypt, took a ship from Arabia to Egypt, and went by ship across the Mediterranean to the island of Sardinia, which was a predominantly Christian area at the time, and then back to the city of Tangier in 1349. Have any of you here been to Syria before? Hopefully not within the last 15 years. Okay, good. This is the fortress of Aleppo. It was a Mamluk fortress. I don't think it's still standing due to the civil war in that country, but that's what it looked like. Not quite yet, I'm getting there. I'm telling you, this is the longest road trip in history.
We'll be ready for the test.
So he spent about a year at home in Morocco, but then in April of 1350, Ibn Battuta heard rumors of a Moroccan army of volunteers who would travel to what today is part of Spain to defend Muslim-controlled Gibraltar from the Christian armies of Alfonso X. For those of you that know anything about Spain at this time period, Spain had been about 500 years or so into what's known as the Reconquista, which is the attempted retaking of the entire Iberian Peninsula from control of the Muslims. For about 700 years, Spain was ruled by a Muslim sultan, the Sultan of Granada. And if any of you have been to cities like Granada or Malaga or Cordoba in Spain, you'll notice that many of them have large cathedrals in the middle of them that were at one point actually mosques. That's neither here nor there. That could be a whole separate presentation too. They are beautiful, and this is one of them. This is the Alhambra in Granada, or part of it. By the time Ibn Battuta arrived in Spain, hoping to take up arms against Alfonso the 11th, my Roman numerals aren't great, I should know this, 11th, Alfonso the 11th had died of the plague, of course. So then he decided to visit Al-Andalus as a traveler and not a soldier. So first Ibn Battuta then traveled in 1350 to the city of Malaga, marveled again at its great mosques, and also its oranges, which were rare in much of the world that he had been in at the time. But he wrote of his love for oranges. Interestingly, I love oranges too. He then continued to the city of Granada, which at that time had been under siege sporadically over the past few centuries from Christian armies. But still, he wrote of its magnificence and its large markets and its beautiful mosques. But he never met with the Sultan there. Couldn't do that, because the Sultan apparently was ill with the plague. But at the end of the year, he returned to Morocco and visited cities like Marrakesh and Fez, at that time also racked with the plague. But the last trip that he ever took would be south now. Not east, not north, but south. To the Mali Empire of West Africa. When he was in Cairo, Ibn Battuta heard of a very famous and fabulously wealthy Muslim king from what was, at the time, probably the largest empire in sub-Saharan Africa, called Mali. That king was named Mansa Musa, and he ruled over the Mali Empire in most of the first half of the 13th century until his death. And after a short stint in Spain, Ibn Battuta then traveled south to see it for himself. At that time, that part of West Africa had been a Muslim kingdom for a while. West Africa was a very early, many people in West Africa were early converts to Islam because they saw the economic advantages of being of the same religion of the people they traded salt with. Because again, the big thing that the West Africans traded with the North Africans was they would trade West African gold for North African salt. Because again, this is a time when salt was used to food, and without salt, we die. But this meant traveling over land across the Sahara Desert. And have any of you ever been to a Sahara country before, like Egypt or Algeria or a few of you? Yeah, it's really hot. It's not exactly pleasant. But his trip took him to the town of Taghaza in what today is in Western Sahara, and the town of Walata in what today is in Mauritania. And at the end of April 1352. And in Walata, Battuta took offense to the customs of the locals who professed to be Muslims. But again, this was a region too where Muslim kings, and Islam was the religion of the elites in West Africa. So Muslim kings and nobles ruled over non-Muslim African subjects. And in this part of the world, in order to not seem too foreign, the Muslim rulers would blend Islam with a lot of local traditions. And this resulted in, for example, a greater degree of gender equality than there was in other parts of the Islamic world, like Arabia or Persia. And this was not unnoticed by Ibn Battuta. But after a short stint in Walata, he made his way south to the Sahel, which is the river valley on the Niger River, to the city of Timbuktu, in what today is in Mali. He marveled at the mosques and the palaces with the Sultan there, who was a Sultan by the name of Mansa Suleiman, the son of Mansa Musa. And he stayed in Mali for a total of 8 months. He observed festivals, palace visitors, and even food. He wrote of the Sultan's palace, "The Sultan has a lofty pavilion where he sits most of the time. There came forth from the gate of the palace, well, let's say 300, I need classes, 300 slaves, and horses and gifts." He wrote of mixed feelings about his stay in Mali. On the one hand, he respected the observation that he made of the parents' strict teaching of the Quran to children, but he criticized many of the local customs. Female slaves and servants who went stark naked into the court for all to see, subjects who groveled before the Sultan, beating the ground with their elbows and throwing dust and ashes over their heads, royal poets who romped about in feathers and bird masks. So the reason why in many of the Islamic world's sultans were not revered as divine figures or as gods is because one of the very foundations, or one of the 5 pillars of Islam is what's called Shahada, which is the profession of faith, and it translates to there is no God except for God. So that's why sultans aren't supposed, or like even political leaders, even nominally secular political leaders are not supposed to be deified. That's blasphemous. But he also wrote, I couldn't include this on here, but Ibn Battuta also wrote of the women he encountered in West Africa. He wrote, "They are extremely beautiful and even more important than the men." The women of West Africa fascinated him, akin to or in a similar way as the women of Persia fascinated him. But after 8 months in Mali, he returned to Morocco in 1353 and stayed in the capital of Fez until 1354. His travels were over. But they weren't forgotten. When he returned home, the Sultan commissioned a poet by the name of, and I'm sure I'm saying this wrong too, Ibn Juzai, to transcribe all of Ibn Battuta's stories for posterity. And those stories are now available in multiple languages, aside from Arabic, including English. So, many of these accounts and translations are dramatized for poetic effect. And so it's hard to know exactly how much of Ibn Juzai's accounts of Ibn Battuta's travels included Ibn Battuta's own writings, and it's hard to know how much of it to trust as fact. But that was the primary way that all of his travels were recorded at once. And exactly what happened after Ibn Battuta returned home for good is not entirely clear. There's not a whole lot of record of the later years of his life. In all likelihood, he probably worked as a judge, but nobody really knows where. And he promptly died at the end of the 1360s. And if any of you have ever been to Tangier, the exact date of his death isn't known, but if any of you have been to Tangier, there's a lot of places that take tourists to see an unmarked grave right here in an urban area that they claim to be his, but no one can really confirm. And also, the airport in Tangier is named the Ibn Battuta Airport. And until recently, there was a stadium in Tangier that was named, if I remember correctly, Stade Ibn Battuta. Stat is the French word because it's Morocco. Okay, that's all. I will happily accept Q&As. I will, oh, I didn't even take those. I'm gonna grab a mic for people. If you'll excuse me for just 5 seconds. Getting a microphone, I'm gonna pass it around. Other way.
I'm interested in your studies and how much work it took for you to prepare this magnum opus of an area of which people have had sort of slight contact. And over what period of time did you prepare
It took me about a
the
month.
text that you read from today?
So those are from a book. I read the translated version of his travels when I was in college. And when I was in college, that book was part of my pre-modern world history class. And at the time, kind of one of the core concepts was ethnocentrism. So we read the translated version of the travels of Battuta to not only learn the history, but also kind of learn how a devout Muslim scholar saw not just other Muslims that he encountered, but also non-Muslims that he encountered all over the rest of the world. But the main source for this was that book, The Travels of Ibn Battuta.
It's a tremendous amount of reading to go.
I highlighted a lot of the important sections when I was in school.
Right. Oh, very good.
It's not very long. The book itself is maybe like a couple hundred pages.
Really? It's
In
not-
English, it's a couple hundred pages, yes. You probably could get away, probably finish that in maybe a weekend. Anybody else?
What was the state of maps at that time?
Yeah, because you had a map there that you used, and I assume that because there's a lot of shipping, that's how great distances were
That's right.
accomplished.
So maps were around, and people had maps. Obviously, all the maps that I used are modern because I figured it would help a modern audience visualize the scale of the travel a little better. But maps at that time were considerably far less sophisticated and far less detailed. They weren't designed for the same type of navigation that we use today. So they didn't have like systems of like coordinates. In the early 14th century, it was very much about, I could probably pull up a map here. See if I can find it. Because if I can, this might answer your question.
It's kind of, how did they visualize the world? Did they think the Earth was a circle, around, we were a ball?
Some people knew that, but not everybody knew that. And the commonplace belief among people that did not have scholarly ambitions was that the Earth was flat.
Yeah.
Sorry, 1 second. This is probably the best example I can give you of a. Look, 1 second. No. This might be the best example I can find offhand of a world map from about the time period. It's not an exact time period, so I can't give you like a great frame of reference, but that's about what the average world map probably would have liked, or would have looked like. Main forms of navigation at the time, of course, the stars, the compass had been invented as well, which was invented by Chinese.
We don't see it.
We can't see it? Oh.
Yeah.
Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, I might have to answer your question separately because of the technology, but thank you. I'll get to that in a second.
I have another question.
Shoot.
Did he mention anything about other travelers that were doing things like this? And I don't know where Marco Polo was during this time.
So Marco Polo wrote about 100 years or so before this.
Okay. And was it known?
Or not 100, this would have been like 50, 60 years before this. Yes, it was known. So there was the Silk Road trade network
Okay.
throughout Central Asia. The Indian Ocean had a trade network that connected India and Persia and Saudi Arabia to Southeast Asia, East Africa, the Maldives, and also China.
Anders, it always intrigues me, how do people get the resources to go from place to place? They may come from very wealthy families, but they still need to get the money or whatever they're using,
Right.
gold, in order to do all this. How does that happen?
Well, in this particular
They get
case,
robbed. So
No, but
they get
how-
robbed,
There's
so
still,
how
there's
do
still,
they get it afterwards?
no, I'm still asking, how do they get the resources
Yeah.
from day to day to sleep where they're gonna sleep,
Oh,
to eat what they're going to eat?
it varies from person to person, but this particular person was born into a very wealthy background.
Yeah, but I get that part. It still has to get to her.
Right.
Do they have, I mean, there's no central bank that he can go
No,
to and get
They
money.
they take big caravans with them. I probably should have made that a little bit more clear in the details, but he didn't travel anywhere alone.
Okay,
No, he
so
had huge entourages of people with him.
huge entourages, all of whom would be collecting some, or
That's right.
taking some of his money to pay for all this stuff.
Bingo.
And he also had jobs along the way.
Yes, he spent time in the employ of various sultans as a legal scholar and judge, which was an important position at the time. Yes.
well, when you said that he was robbed several times, I would assume that
Every money, all the money that he had was robbed, was taken. So it's like, does he go back to another country or?
He did that a few times.
Okay.
He went back to Egypt after
Okay.
the unrest in what was at the time part of southern Egypt on the way to Mecca. Yes, Al?
We still have the problem of how did he get that enormous family wealth along with him in all of this?
Yes.
He would seem to need to refresh that from time to time.
Yep. That's where he took employ at various sultans' courts, like in Persia and in India and in East Africa.
So he made pretty good wages at those places.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh, and in Tunisia as well.
Did he mention much about the Jewish population? There was a large Jewish population in southern Spain and certainly in the Mideast.
Yes, he did.
And even in India.
Yes, he did. He, like you said, they encountered his best detailed encounters of Jews are from his time in Jerusalem and from his time in Hebron. There's not a whole lot of detail about any Jews that he encountered in India or in Spain, but he did encounter he wrote most about his encounter with Jews in what is at the time, or what at the time was the Mamluk Sultanate in Jerusalem and Hebron. He wrote generally favorably. Jews are seen as they call it in Islam, people of the book, because their prophets are still the descendants of Abraham, but their prophets are the descendants of Abraham's son Isaac. And if my Old Testament knowledge is correct, Muslim prophets are the descendants of Abraham's other son, Ishmael. But it's a kind of a branch of that single covenant in, I believe, Genesis 17. Abraham's covenant, thank you. And it's common, even at that time, it was common for Muslims to incorporate religious practices that originated with Jews. For example, monotheism arguably originates with Jews. Circumcision was a common practice in the Islamic world at the time. And
laws.
sorry? Yes, and dietary laws. In Judaism, it's kosher, but in Islam, it's halal. So, like, Muslims don't eat pork. Jews also, well, kosher Jews don't eat pork. They don't mix. I can't remember what the other ones are. But he generally writes favorably of his encounters with Jews in the Middle East. But most of his writings. Throughout most of the trip, if you read the book, throughout most of the trip, you can tell he makes quite an effort to be around as many Muslims as possible. But he does meet, for example, like Orthodox Christians in Constantinople, Hindus in India, people of various spiritual traditions in China. But he did encounter Jews, mostly in the Middle East.
Did he say how he died?
That's not known.
Oh.
It's not known how he died. He died in that, also not known when either. Some say 1368 or 1369. At that time, he would have been in his mid-60s, which for the time period was pretty old. And no one really knows much about the later stages of his life after he returned from West Africa.
Is there any other person like him other than the one I just mentioned earlier?
Magellan, maybe?
Who?
Magellan? Francis Drake? Maybe Marco Polo?
Marco Polo, I think of that.
Francis Drake? Zhang He? There's a few. I can probably think of a few.
But weren't they mostly sailors?
Right.
So they weren't going across land as much.
No.
So if I may just remark, I think
Thank
what
you.
you've given us is a tour de force and a great addition to our knowledge of almost prehistory. Thank you.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm so sorry, folks. I'm going to have to cut questions short. I have got to use the bathroom, and I also have not eaten lunch, so I'm starving.